NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
In a small island in the Pacific, a long time ago, in a different time, in a different place, there was great excitement because they were told that the most eligible and famous bachelor would be returning home to choose a wife. That bachelor's name was Johnny Lingo. Johnny Lingo was handsome, wealthy, and popular. And soon it spread across the island that Johnny would come home to choose a wife from all the eligible girls on the island. Johnny was confronted at first by the local village trader who talked to him about this, and Johnny informed him that he had chosen to bargain for a girl named Mahana, which was quite a shock because Mahana was deemed to be the ugliest girl on the entire island. So ugly that no one even ever wanted to look at her or even saw her. She lived up in the trees. And pretty soon, the rumors spread across the island that Johnny was going to be bargaining for Mahana. And everybody was shocked at the news. On this island, the way you purchased a wife or obtained a wife was by bargaining with the father for cows. For cows. You would sit down and you would offer an amount, and the father would counter-offer, and eventually you would come to an agreement, and the purchase would be made of a wife or a dowry of cows. And when the bargaining took place, the whole village would gather together to watch the bargaining. And everybody was very excited because Johnny Lingo was the shrewdest trader, and they had all determined that the reason Johnny must be bargaining for Mahana is because he was going to get her on the cheap. So much so that the joke went around that if the father asked for one cow, Johnny would get her for the horns and the tail. Well, the day of the bargaining came, everybody gathered together, and Johnny sat down across from the father, and the father offered up Mahana for 3 cows. And the village burst into laughter. How could Mahana, the ugly, be worth 3 cows? This was craziness. Johnny paused, raised his hand to settle them down, looked for a long moment at her father's eyes and said, 3 cows is a lot for Mahana. Not enough. I will pay 8 cows for Mahana. The village went silent. No one had ever paid 8 cows for a wife before. In fact, soon it had spread across the entire island, and before Johnny even made it back to the trader had learned that he had paid 8 cows. And when Johnny approached the trader to make a purchase of a gift to be delivered for Mahana as a wedding gift, the trader looked at him and said, 8 cows, that's more than anybody's ever paid on the island ever before for a wife. Why would you do such a thing? And Johnny thought for a moment and looked off into space and said, that's such good news. Everyone will forever know that Johnny Lingo paid 8 cows for Mahana. And as he walked out the door, the trader thought for a moment and said, I understand. Johnny Lingo is vain. He paid 8 cows for the worst so that everybody would always know that Johnny Lingo was an extravagant man who paid the most for the worst. Some time passed after Johnny and Mahana were married, and they went away for a year, and they returned. And when they returned, the trader had the gift that he had purchased, a beautiful silver mirror that he had purchased for Mahana, and was going down to the hut of Johnny Lingo to deliver it. And when he got there, he saw Mahana's father yelling and screaming at Johnny. It didn't make any sense. Why was he yelling? He'd been paid his 8 cows. They were all healthy. He'd walked around for months boasting about his 8 cows. Why in the world could he be mad? He stormed off, and the trader approached. He saw Mahana walk out of the hut. And there she was, beautiful, clean, happy, charming, intelligent. And he approached Johnny and he said, I don't understand. How can that possibly be Mahana? How can it be? Johnny stopped for a moment and said, Mahana and I were best friends from when we were little. We used to play in the fields all the time, and I loved her deeply, with all my heart. But in her father's house, she was worth nothing. It was the cows. The cows changed her. The cows were what made her who she is. How does a person feel when they're bargained for less? But for me, she was always worth the most. Then he winked and said, and don't you think I got a pretty good deal? This little fable is a great psychological, instructive lesson for us on a lot of things. First of all, as trial lawyers, we're faced with a problem. You might look at that story and say, oh, what kind of a world do we live in where people are buying a woman for cows? You called her ugly. How dare you? On and on. There's 1,000 levels that you could stop at and shut down on me on that story. At the same time, if you're willing to stop and listen to the message beyond it, you can say to yourself, am I treating the people in my life, my loved ones, my children, my wife, my husband, my spouse, my parents, our clients, like they're worth 8 cows? Or are we treating them like they're worth the tails and the hoofs? Which is it? And I would challenge us, each of us, as we think about this, there's this goofy story of Johnny Lingo, that perhaps we can consider that we change our attitude to treat people like they're worth 8 cows. And not just people, but our cases. Because I would submit to you, before we go back to the presentation, that too often we walk in believing ourselves to be losers and that our cases are nothing more than dogs. And you're right. There are cases we're defense attorneys. There are cases that we probably can't win. We probably can't. And then there are cases that maybe we could have won. And maybe cases we should have won. And somewhere between the ones that we do win and the ones that we could never have won are a lot of cases that we treat like they're worth 1 cow or 2 cows instead of 8. And I would challenge you, I would invite you to reconsider your cases and your personal worth as trial lawyers. Because each of you is worth 8 cows. You are. You just have to start seeing yourself that way. All right, let's go on. And I want to talk about something that has been discussed here, and I don't want to take away from anybody that's used it, but there's this concept in psychology and in social psychology, by the way, the difference between the individual and the group study of the way people interact, called cognitive dissonance. Now, we could spend an entire day, in fact, an entire semester, discussing cognitive dissonance. But for the purposes of a jury, I want to help us understand how it applies to our problems every day. And more importantly, it's going to really become important as I discuss the next 3 principles of dilemma, urgency, and concession. So let's start with our understanding of what cognitive dissonance really means to us in this circumstance. And that is this. People, jurors, have an inner need to ensure that their beliefs and their behaviors are consistent. So they want to believe that what they're doing is consistent with their behavior. And when they have inconsistent behaviors or beliefs that are coming in conflict with each other, it creates an internal struggle. For example, if we have let me actually, before I give you the example, let me do one more thing. The cognitive dissonance has levels, like all things. The greater the strength of the dissonance, the more pressure there is to relieve feelings. So the more you have this internal struggle, the more you're going to want to get rid of it somehow, some way. And cognitions, such as personal beliefs, tend to result in greater dissonance. Finally, when there is an inconsistency between attitudes and behaviors, something's got to change. It will always change. If it doesn't change, then that dissonance will create internal conflict that's almost unbearable, and the individual will force it to change. So here's the problem of cognitive dissonance. How in the world am I supposed to vote not guilty when you've got somebody who's looking at pornography of 7-year-olds? And I like sex cases to talk about because they're the most extreme examples. That's a dissonance. Come on, we're all seasoned defense attorneys here. None of us like that crap. We don't like it. If we walked in and learned that somebody was doing that and, was screwing 7-year-old girls, we don't want that guy in society. I know that people out there think that criminal defense attorneys, we want to free him. That's not true. We've dealt with our own dissonance in another way, but the jury doesn't have time to deal with their dissonance. They're told right off the bat, it's a sex case, and the charges are he was having sex with a 6-year-old girl. That's a problem, and dissonance has begun to be created within them. How in the world can they vote not guilty for something that clearly is contrary to their core internal beliefs? And really, quite frankly, an internal belief of almost all of us. Almost all. In fact, 99.999. I don't even know who wouldn't be at that core belief. So that dissonance is very real, and that's what dissonance is. It's when you're asked to do something against a core belief. So how do we solve this problem? How do we deal with dissonance? Well, let's start off with this. I call it the principle of the dilemma. They hate the charge. They hate it. They loathe it. But is there something worse than somebody having sex with a 6-year-old girl who's 52 years old? Is there? I would say probably no. Oh, no, but there is. That's the problem of the dilemma. Do you know what's worse than having somebody that's 51-year-old having sex with a 6-year-old girl? Exactly. Being falsely accused is on the spectrum of cognitive dissonance that's equal to the act. Because none of us would want to be falsely accused. And by the way, I love this, to ask a jury, and well, I know you don't all get voir dire. I know it's a little bit more of a Western thing, I think, than an Eastern. We get more voir dire in the West than you do here in the East. But even in opening statement, or in closing definitely, you can say this. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, each one of us here today can promise that we would never have sex with a 6-year-old girl. But can any of us promise that we will never be falsely accused of having sex with a 6-year-old girl? What a powerful thought. Every one of us can promise that we won't do something, but can we promise that we will not be falsely accused of doing something? No one can make that problem. No one. Because you can't. Hence the phrase falsely accused. So that's how we eliminate the dilemma, or create the dilemma to eliminate the dissonance. On one side is the sexual problem and the charges that all of us abhor, and on the other side is the dilemma that we've created by saying this is a falsely accused individual. Now, I know that might sound simplistic. You say, well, in all of our cases we say that he's falsely accused. No, I'm not sure we do. I'm not sure that we really come out and declare with an absolute missionary zeal of fervor that this is such a case. We meander. We tell stories, which are not bad. Stories are great. They're a great way to communicate, but we meander. I would submit to you that one essential element beyond the principle of the dilemma is coming right out and telling them this is a problem. And it's going to lead us into the principle of urgency in a moment. So here's the way we do this. One, and by the way, I have to pause. My written work has nothing to do with what I've talked about today. It's all about something else so that you can read about something. They'll make this available, I hope, so that you can get this as my written work. And I put extra things up there to help you down the road. So I just wanted to say that. Here, though, right now, let's look at this dilemma. So one of the ways we handle this, we acknowledge the immediate dissonance created when they say you have to presume someone's innocent. We all know that saying presume him innocent is really kind of weak. Yeah, I presume him innocent. Of course I presume him innocent. Look at him over there. He's been charged with all of these crimes and he looks like that. Yeah, I presume him innocent. Right? No, we have to create this problem with a new dissonance. We can do this by creating internal conflicts, being falsely accused, being wrongfully accused. I was just talking with a gentleman down here about a case that he has, a sexual assault case. It's a shakedown case. We were just talking about that. No, it's not a sexual assault case. The guy's been shaken down. You've created the dissonance in them. Now they've got a new problem, but they have a way out of their previous dissonance because of the new dissonance. Another way to do it is to present attractive alternatives or create a villain that allows you to point in another direction. Along these lines is the principle of urgency. Now, in Persuasion, the principle of urgency is when you see on the internet you have 36 hours to respond. Or when you buy your tickets for the show, it says you've got 4 minutes until we cancel your order. That's not done so that you have 4 minutes to cancel your order. That's because a whole bunch of psychologists and social psychologists got paid a lot of money to figure out how to get people pay more. And what they found is if they put a ticking clock, sales go up like 35%. Okay? So that is created by psychologists. It's like the same thing you see on the websites when they say 1,000 people are looking at this and 495 just booked. Those are all psychological principles meant to suck you in. Well, guess what? They apply in a jury trial too. And the principle of urgency is one where we come into a jury with an attitude of immediate problems. We have a problem and we couldn't get it taken care of without you 12. And the problem is my client's not guilty of this crime. They're innocent, truly innocent. And we need you now. We need you right now. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if you get voir dire, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I want you to know straight up right now, first words out of my mouth are, we have a problem and we are here to have you solve it because we had nowhere else to go. And that problem is my client didn't do what they claim he did. This is all false, bogus charges, and we're here to talk with you about it. Can we visit on that? Urgency. Now, again, not every case requires this, but it's a tool. But urgency creates a situation psychologically that puts people off. It throws them off. And if you can get them out of their game, you have an open door to eliminate their prior biases, their desire to follow the authority, the desire to do all kinds of things that they would not have done otherwise because of their cognitive dissonance and their preconceived notions. So creating urgency is really important. I just had the very wonderful benefit of speaking to the public defender's office in San Francisco. A wonderful office of very dedicated people, very diligent and exceptional lawyers. And we were talking about this concept for a while. And it really caught flame because where we have voir dire, a lot of them were saying, oh my gosh, I've never considered this. This is the problem. Urgency is a problem. Ladies and gentlemen, in opening statement, we are here because we couldn't go anywhere else. You know what? That guy over there is sitting in that chair not because he's guilty. It's because this is the only way out of false charges. Do you feel that sense? That's what we have to create if we want to eliminate some of that dissonance. It interrupts. It breaks them open. It allows for a different point of view to take place. And it leads us to the third principle, the principle of concession. Now, we all know this idea that we concede to look credible. I'm not talking about that. That's fine. We concede to look credible. Fighting everything makes you look like a jackass. But concession doesn't necessarily, in this point, mean an overall, I've conceded a few points to gain credibility. It actually means something a little bit different. It's that we concede points followed by our counters to eliminate the dissonance. So here's how it goes. You concede a simple point, and then you follow it with something like a but or a however. That's one way. Another way to use concession is to use it to teach. So let me do both of those with the teaching one first. I love this to talk about reasonable doubt. And I know somebody else is going to present, so I don't want to take away from that, but here's just a little thought. Ladies and gentlemen, you've talked a lot about reasonable doubt in this trial. And by the way, let me give you maybe an example that might help you. You remember at the very beginning, they asked one of the witnesses to identify my client, and I had him stand up. And they looked at him. And they looked at him clearly, and they said, That's my brother. Obviously, why did I have him stand? Well, it's coming. That's my brother. I know him because he's my brother. Thank you, sir. And remember that moment that happened in the trial? That's an exceptionally good example of reasonable doubt. You don't have any reasonable doubt that that's his brother, right? That's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, let's talk about everything that followed after there, where you have all kinds of questions and problems. They don't meet that standard, do they? Do you see how we did that? We conceded something obvious to teach a principle. We were able to teach reasonable doubt by taking something that we didn't care about and saying, see, they proved that beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a fact. It's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Now you've got a gut feel for it. You know how to analyze reasonable doubt because it should be to the level of, I recognize him, he's my brother. Wouldn't that be great if that was the standard? Well, just make it so. Now everything falls below that. Okay, that's one way to use the power of concession. But here's the other way. And President Theodore Roosevelt was an exceptionally good speaker and gifted at using this technique. What he would do is he would put the "it's true that" followed by the "but." So you concede the front end followed by the back end. So here's an example. And I wrote this down because I wanted us to be able to read and look at it at the same time. They did find a gun in his car. That's the concession. They did find a gun in his car. That's where we've conceded. But the "but" now changes the mind to reconsider. Is it unfair to ask who actually fired the gun? This gun? Together we'll explore the test statements and the results. That's a concession. It's a psychological tool that, when used, can create a real benefit. And the way it works is by simply saying, I concede to this, but. Here's another example in closing. They did find the gun. We all agree it was in my client's car. However, that's the transitory phrase. Is it right that no one ever bothered to do any of the following to check who fired it? We asked all those questions, remember? We asked about gunshot residue. Nothing. We asked about ballistics. Nothing. We asked about fingerprints. Heaven's sakes, it's the year 2019. How hard is it to take a couple of fingerprints off of a gun? Nothing. The principle here of concession is not conceding some overall credibility. It's conceding the point so that you allow the dissonance to drop, followed by the counter-argument that allows you, with your new dissonance, to create a new baseline, a new level. By the way, they do this to us also in marketing. They spend millions to do this. You go to buy your iPad, they say $800. But if you want the extra memory, it's $200 more for $1,000. They put the $1,000 down there, and guess what? Your new baseline becomes $1,000. People are willing to spend significantly more money because they're tricking the heck out of us by doing this. And then they throw on there, you better buy it in 30 minutes or it's gone forever. Those are very real principles, and this is a way to do it in trial. Concede, followed by the word "but," however, yet, and then your counter-argument that's a new, more powerful, acceptable cognition. All right. One more. I like this one. This is an attacking for police officers and the fact that they control everything. The foundations of security are given to a conscientious and diligent police force. Right? We can say that because you don't want to blow every police officer out of the water. So you can concede. The foundations of security are given to a conscientious and diligent police force. And yet, here we are, faced with the judgment of one man's bad acts, tasked to decide if there's a bad apple in the bunch. In other words, is there a dirty cop in this case? But do you see how that creates a different feeling? It's different. If you just come right out and say, this is a case about a dirty cop, no, this is a case where we love our police officers. They're good people. But we're tasked here to find if there's a bad apple in the bunch. Another way to do this, we're all grateful for the powers that the police are given to secure the scenes in dangerous situations, even putting themselves at great risk. But can we forget that it is them and them alone? See, notice, but can we forget that it is them and them alone that had the power to control the scene with guns, and flashing lights and yellow tape. They chose what to photograph, what to secure, what to fingerprint, what to put in little plastic baggies for all of us later to review. All of us. And what did they do? Nothing. Right? See how we've done that? See how we've removed the dissonance or changed the feelings by using the word but. Right there. And following it with our new, more acceptable question. Okay. Now, this leads us to the next principle of what I like to call redefining the issues. And redefining the issues says that often when we go in and we say, this is a case, and we talked about a little earlier, not letting them define our cases, but when we go in, we talk about themes, but really it's better if it's a question. And we redefine the issue by forcing the jury to ask a question that's acceptable to them. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you're asked here to evaluate a DUI case and determine whether or not my client is not guilty based upon bad scientific evidence. Well, that's one way to say it, but really you've just bought into all of their problems, all of their biases that they came in with, and you're probably not going to get anywhere. So one thing we can do is to refocus our questions and change it. And one way to do that is to redefine the problem, redefine the grounds. It's the same with a self-defense case. When you have a self-defense case, one of the ways to do it is to recognize these principles. Killing is bad, everyone agrees. Killing is not bad on a battlefield. We give medals for that. Therefore, we should place our client onto a battlefield in order to present our case of self-defense. So we say it like this. Killing is a heroic act on the battlefield. It is a crime in the realm of civilized society. But the single question, and this is the way you redefine the issue, is you tell the jury, we're not here to decide whether or not killing is bad. We're here to decide this question. Was this a temporary battlefield upon which my client found himself? Created by the circumstances that normally would not have been a battlefield. And again, I'm not saying necessarily the word battlefield. That's the word I've chosen for this. But the point is to redefine the question. Another way to do it is, I like it in a DUI, is this. DUI. You could say it was a DUI, or you could ask this question. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we're here to find one question. Can a man at the end of a 12-hour shift in the pouring rain perform complicated scientific tests in order to determine the validity of a man's alcohol content? That's a little complex. But you know what I just said? Can he perform field sobriety tests? That's what I said. Except for, think about this. Can a man perform tests at the end of his shift? I didn't say this, I should have. At 5 in the morning, in the pouring rain, perform complicated scientific tests. Those are 4 cognitive dissonances that go in my favor. End of a shift, no one does well at the end of a shift. At 5 in the morning, no one does well at 5 in the morning. In the pouring rain, right? And perform complicated science tests. Well, complicated science tests, I don't want to talk about that, right? Isn't that a much better question to ask than, did the officer do the field sobriety test correctly? If you ask it that way, they've already decided. But if you ask it the other way, you're forcing them to recreate in their brains the problem. And by the way, when you get to your examinations, you're going to be able to prove up every one of those things. The battlefield is going to be easy. The DUI test is going to be easy. Sir, it was the end of your shift. Yes. It was 5 in the morning. Yes. It was pouring rain. Yes. Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I just nailed them all, right? So you redefine them. That's the way to redefine them. Okay. Now, let's go on to another principle. There's this concept that's been brewing in psychology, and especially with social psychologists for the last 5 or 10 years. It's really interesting. It's called choice blindness. And it's created kind of a little bit of a fervor. And this is the way it goes. I'm going to explain this study. They showed the subject a series of pictures of people. 2 men, 2 women, 2 men, 2 women. And they asked them to choose. So, for example, they showed a blonde with earrings and a brunette with no earrings. And they asked to choose. And the person picks the brunette. They set the cards down and they slide it to them. However, they did a little magic trick. They slid to them the opposite photo. So they picked the brunette, but they slid to them a picture of the blonde with the earrings. And then they waited just a few moments and asked them, look at the pictures and tell us why you picked that person. And rarely, and by the way, you can do this online. You could do it online. There's a test, and I actually even know the test is coming, and I still can't. It's like I do it. Rarely did anybody notice that they picked the wrong person, number one. And second, what did they do immediately when they got the picture? They started justifying why they chose that person. Well, I like the earrings, and I like the blonde hair. But you picked a brunette with no earrings. Doesn't matter. They start to justify their beliefs based upon what they see was their choice, not what they actually believe. And the scientists thought, hey, wait a second, this is really intriguing. We should take this further. So they went out on the streets. And by the way, I imagine a lot of you are very incredulous right now about this, and I would never do that. Well, welcome to the 80% of people that think they're above average. That's why I start with the foundational elements. So at any rate, they went out on the streets and they asked a bunch of people political questions, and they asked them if they were red or blue, and then they made their statement, and then they asked them a series of questions that were not necessarily easy, but were not complicated either about their positions on different things. Meanwhile, the person over here was recording them opposite. They put them back together, and they went back and asked them about their political opinions about why they chose this. Once in a rare while, they would say, oh, that's a mistake, I meant the other, but rarely. Surprisingly, you know what they did? They immediately justified their answer. They justified their answer. In some cases, they even became quite adamant about it. And later, when they were challenged a little bit more, they started to look for reasons at a deeper level why they would feel that way. The point here about choice blindness is that people often, and their behaviors often, are not decided by how they come in with their attitude, but what happens at the end. Again, you don't believe me? I'll give you an example. How many times you talk to a juror at the end of a case and they tell you all the reasons they convicted your client? Right? They're just going along with what they've decided. And a lot of times, it hasn't been decided for them. It was decided by the group, and they just went along, and now they're going to justify it. So we need to recognize that this is going on and deal with it. And really, I'm not even sure exactly how to put this into context of a jury trial yet, because this is a fairly new thing, and I have never done anything with it in a trial. I just know it's a concept and a problem. Our choices often affect our attitudes, not the other way around. All right. Time is short, so this is a fun study, so I'm going to talk about the principle of reciprocity. This might be a little bit better for business. How many here are public defenders? Oh, way too many. All right. So private lawyers. Okay. I don't know how to apply this to public defenders. At any rate, it's just an interesting concept of reciprocity. And it does work a little bit in trial, but I was going to make mention about how to do it with our businesses. But this is the way it goes. So they did some studies, a whole bunch of studies, but this one I love. They had all these people go into a restaurant, and they had waiters who were the Confederates. They were the ones that were there to do the study. And the waiter would treat everybody the same, and at the very end, they would give no candy. And they would get a tip, and they would record all those tips for a period of 30 days. And they would see how much tips they got. Then they would give a candy, just a little treat on the tray. And they would watch what happened to the tips. And the tips went up by 3%. 3%. Then they gave 2 candies. They did another month of this, and they gave 2 candies. Tips went up overall for the month by 14%. Now, that doesn't mean somebody's giving 14% more. It just means that over the month, 14% more. But it's the last one that's the most interesting. When it was personalized, tips increased to 24%. And this is what personalized was. They left the candies. They would walk away about 3 or 4 feet. They would stop, and they would reach into their pockets. And they'd turn back and say, you know what? You've been such wonderful guests. Here's a few more candies. And they would leave it. I'm afraid to tell waiters this because it'll cost me a fortune. But this is what they found. And the principle of reciprocity in Persuasion says the following. If you commit people to things and you give them things, they're going to feel obligated to give you back. Now, how do we do that in front of a jury? There's a lot of ways to do it. Politeness, kindness, paying attention. I do it this way. I try to pay really attention and close attention to their needs to go to the bathroom. Sometimes I'll just say, Judge, you know what? Maybe it's time for us to take a break. So I try to obligate them any way I can. It's hard to do because it's not something we can do often. In your business minds, you might think of ways that you can do this when you have clients come through the door. We won't go into that. But reciprocity works in a very powerful way, and it's a very powerful tool to go. Okay, the principle of scarcity is another principle of persuasion that's most intriguing. It says that when we don't think we're going to get something, we value it more. We want it more. If I tell you I'm going to take something away from you very quickly, the chances are you're going to say, wait a second, I want that. It's why salesmen for 1,000 years have said, hey, this deal's only going to last for a minute. Now, most of us now, when a prosecutor says, this is a today only deal, yeah, pick a finger, you know. I'm not giving you today only. When somebody says that to me, I want to poke him in the nose, right? But that's the principle of scarcity in effect, and it does work on us all the time, because I just bought 2 tickets to go see a play tomorrow night, knowing this doggone principle that I'm going to take my wife to in the Kennedy Center, because we're from the West Coast, and the Kennedy Center sounds fancy, and we're going to be in Washington, and so I think it's really cool to buy tickets, and it said to me, you better buy now, there's only 2 seats left. I had to buy them. It was scarce. So I did, when the truth is I wanted to go to the comedy show, but now I'm going to see some play about an Egyptian band in the Israeli desert for one night. I have no clue, but I did, and I suckered into it. Principle of scarcity. Okay, here's what we do in a trial, though. You can increase a piece of evidence by making it feel more scarce or more unique by simply telling them words. Ladies and gentlemen, you're only going to have this for a moment. This piece of evidence is going to come and you're only going to see it for a minute. I like to do this with demonstrative evidence that I'm not going to submit into evidence. I'm not sure of everybody's evidentiary rules, but in California, we have a lot of demonstrative evidence that ultimately gets marked but not submitted. I like to do this here. Ladies and gentlemen, you're only going to get this evidence for a little moment. This is the only time you're going to get to see it. You're not going to get to see it again. Boy, that increases the value of it. It makes it more desirable. I have a principle that I like to do that I've done it on a few trials. It's a lot of fun. If you can have, and it's also attaches to the principle of authority, and the way you introduce somebody makes them more credible. But here's the thing I like to do. You have a complex case. I do it in fraud cases sometimes, where you have the need for an accountant to come in and testify, and you just don't feel confident about it. So what I do is I tell a jury at the beginning, we're going to have a special guest star attorney who's going to come in for just a moment to do the cross-examination of their forensic expert. And I do. I have a friend who comes in who is an exceptionally good lawyer at cross-examining experts, and his sole job is to come in for 1 hour, cross-examine the expert, and leave. And here's the principle of scarcity at work and authority. In opening statement, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be bringing in a special guest star. You're not going to see him here right now. You're not going to be here for the whole trial, but he's one of the best forensic lawyers in the country. He's fabulous. He's going to come in here, and he won't be the entire trial, but he's going to come in here and deal with their forensic accountant, and he's going to talk to him about things. And then he's going to leave. Scarcity and authority. I've just created this character who's going to show up along with anticipation and interest. And when they come in, it makes for a moment. The door's open. In walks the lawyer. He comes in. He sits down. He listens to it. He does the cross-examination. He's the more knowledgeable guy, because I've already told the jury in opening statement, this is one of the most knowledgeable men in the world on this subject. And then he leaves. Principle of scarcity. All right. Let's talk about this. The principle of the micro. It attaches to the principle of the macro. And the principle of the micro says this: breaking things down into their smallest units can make them seem much, much bigger. So let me give you an example. Let's just go right to the example. You ever have a client who doesn't want to plead guilty to something, and you know doggone well they should, because if they go to trial, they're screwed? Anybody ever? Oh, well, all of us. And you say to him, hey, look, dude, if you don't take this 4-year offer, you're going to do 9 years. And his response is, I could do 9 years on the shitter. Right? We've all had that happen. Well, here's the principle of a micro at work. You don't say to him 4 versus 9, because 4 versus 9 doesn't sound like that much. But I'll tell you what sounds like an awful lot. Mr. Client, your offer currently is 4 years, 1,460 days. You've already done 290 of those, so we can subtract those right off the top. But if you go to trial and lose, you're going to do 3,285 days. 3,285 days is a lot scarier than 9 years. Right? That's a lot scarier, especially when you get to day 1,824, knowing that you've got to do 1,825 more days. Or actually, it's day 1,461. and knowing you've got to do 1,825 days. That's the principle of the micro. You break it down to its smallest unit to make it seem much larger. And it's a very powerful psychological tool. You can look around and see it happening all over the place. And at the same time, you can see the principle of the macro taking place in daily life. Now, how do you use it in cross-examination, opening statement, closing? Well, one of the ways to do it is you break things down frame by frame, step by step, so that it slows everything down to a compacted period of time with lots of little pieces that make it seem much greater, truthfully, by the way, than it would appear if you just said, he did X. So if you say he just did X, well, that's one thing. But if you break it down into its pieces, it's worth much more, or it has greater ability. And by the way, this gets used against us all the time, so you should be aware of it. Another way is to slow time. So let's talk about the principle of the macro, and then we'll do some examples of both of these. The principle of the macro says exactly the opposite, but it's equally true. People tend to minimize the actuality of things when described in small numbers. So they look at things as being much smaller or minimize it. For example, the earth. If I just say the earth, it conjures up an image. But what could I break the earth down to in the micro? In the principle of the micro, I could go clear down to the very micro, right? To the atomic level. And you could talk for an eternity about the earth. Or you could just say the earth. Big concepts, little concepts. They take on different meanings, and you should recognize this. Now, let's talk about how to do this. In the opposite, 10 years seems a lot easier to do than 3,650 days, right? So we use that concept. But now let's look at it in trial terms. For example, you want to show that the officer did very little. They did so little that it's almost embarrassing. You can say, well, Detective Jones, you looked at this case a year ago, right? Or you could do it this way. Detective Jones, isn't it true, sir, that you looked at this case, or that more than 379 days have passed since you began this case, since this case happened, right? And in that 379 days, isn't it true that you spent less than 1 hour of time investigating this entire case? The entire case. 1 hour. And by the way, you laid the foundation for that earlier, so you could say that. But isn't that different than saying, hey, you just investigated this case a year ago? Do you see the powerful difference between the two? 379 days have passed, and you haven't done a doggone thing. You spent 1 hour 379 days ago. And by the way, I actually debated whether or not I would want to put 22 minutes up there or 1 hour. But in a lot of ways, 1 hour sounds less than 22 minutes or 37 minutes. And it definitely sounds like less than 52 minutes. Oh, you only spent an hour on that. 52 minutes sounds almost like you did more because you broke it down into units. Do you see how the micro and the macro interplay? In your cross-examinations, in your opening statements, use these tools to enhance something. My stupid son, no, he's not stupid, he's wonderful. Someday he may watch. He and I were joking one day, and God, my wife's going to kill me when she hears that I said this. I won't tell her. He and I were once calculating the amount of urine that takes place in a single day. You want to talk about the principle of the micro? It's like Olympic swimming pools. It's huge. It's like huge numbers. And he's doing all the math, and we were joking about it. That, I know, right? Gross. It's terribly terrible. I know. I feel it even as I want to take it back. But the point here is that it's a powerful image. But if you just say everybody goes to the bathroom once a day, so what? But if you put it all together, it's huge. And it's really gross, right? It's gross. A swimming pool full of all of that? That's the principle right there at work. Here's another way to reverse it. If you want to make it look the opposite direction. Detective Jones, isn't it true? You did a photo lineup and no one identified my client. Okay, that's just a 10,000-foot level. But let's break it down. You can slow this thing down and make it look huge if you want it to be that no one identified your client. Officer Jones, you came into the room. Yes. And you sat down. Yes. And you were very careful. Yes. And you pulled out a piece of paper. Yes. That you had prepared. Yes. With all those pictures on it. Those unbiased pictures of 4 men with mustaches and 1 man without. All of those you pulled out, right? Yes. And then you sat down with him and you went through it and you gave him all the opportunity. See how you can slow it down? And you can finally arrive at the place where you say, and my client looked at all of those pictures for a long time. In fact, he looked at him for minutes. And you can even pause for 10 seconds and say, 15 periods of what just passed. Right? And then he looked at you, officer, and he said, what? I don't recognize any of them. Right? That's a lot different. It's a different feel. And it's because the principle of the micro and the macro play upon all of us psychologically. You may want it to be just, hey, you looked at the photo lineup, you didn't see my client. But you might also want to make it much, much bigger. Two principles at work. Okay. Now, everybody knows this one. It's one that we seem to be taught in law school from the very beginning, the principles of primacy and recency. Principle says that the first thing you hear and the last thing you hear are the things that you mostly memorize or remember. This is true. But how do you use it? Now, most of us say, well, the first thing I'm going to say on cross-examination and the last thing I'm going to say on cross-examination. Right? Yes, but you've just sold yourself way too short. Let's use it way better than that because there's a lot of ways to do it. Primacy and recency doesn't just mean the beginning of the talk or the end of the talk. It means at the beginning of concepts or changes or whatever. For example, I can be talking right now about football, which is the primacy, and maybe the recency. I pause. I had a really good dinner last night. I went to such and such. I've created a new place for primacy and recency. Do you see that? We've taken ourselves from one situation and given it a definite ending so that recency can kick in. We've paused long enough for them to process it, to hold it, maybe even to invite them to write it down. I haven't had a ton of success with jurors writing things down that I've asked them to, but sometimes we do. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, that was important. Why don't we take a moment? If you'd like to write it down, we're going to be changing subjects. See that? We're going to be changing subjects. Okay. Now we're on to a new subject. So primacy and recency is a tool that you should use as often as you can in a trial when you find it necessary. Do you know what you don't want to do? Just babble through. Just keep going. Because then it just gets lost. And your good stuff in the middle really does just kind of mush out. All right. This is where I was supposed to be at the hour. Principal have pointed it out. Before we left for the break, and many of you didn't hear the little story I told, but those of you who did, I told you a few things about it. And by the way, the story isn't that offensive, but it might be to some. They might say, oh my gosh, you're buying women for cows? How terrible of a story. I took this story intentionally because I do think it's sweet, and I really do believe that if we start to treat each other like we're all worth 8 cows, that we're better off. But the real point of the story was to say that often we have problems in our case. Psychological problems, factual problems, emotional problems, whatever they might be. And one psychological principle says that if you point out the problem ahead of time, tell the people of the problem ahead of time, allow them to process the problem ahead of time, that you can minimize the power of the problem as opposed to just dropping it in their lap. If I had walked back in and told the story of Johnny Lingo to the audience and talked about cows, a lot of you might shut down and said, oh my gosh, is that guy selling women for cows? That's human trafficking. But I pointed it out. I said it was a vintage story from an ancient time on a different island, and it's just a fable, and it's just an allegory, and it has the power to help you if you'll let go of your emotions, if you'll open your heart, if you'll listen, and if you won't judge, and if you'll treat it with respect. Suddenly the story that could be about human trafficking is about how we treat one another, because I pointed it out, and that's a psychological principle. You use it when you have bad facts in a case. I've been accused of this, and it's true. When something bad happens in my trial, I almost always say, absolutely. Yeah, on that point I saw your client shoot the gun at him. Absolutely, you saw my client with the gun, didn't you? Absolutely. It creates a dissonance. It's kind of like this. Ask me if I'm from Baltimore. No. Right? So what am I, from Baltimore or not? No. All right. Time is short, so I'm going to move past some of these things. Okay, let's talk about the principle of commitment. Principal commitment is a very interesting concept that says in Persuasion that when people are asked to commit to something, they won't necessarily commit to something big, but they will commit to something small. So here's what happened. They did this study where they went out and asked people to put these huge lawn signs up about something that was innocuous. And people said, no, I won't put that huge law sign up. I don't want to do it. And the vast majority wouldn't do it. But later, they went to them and they gave them a little postcard with the same thing on it and said, would you put this in your window? And people said, oh yeah, sure. I'll be glad to put that in the window. So they put it in the window. And they left it there for a week, and then they came back to them a week later and said, hey, would you mind putting in this bigger sign in your front yard? And guess what? The numbers went way high. Because once they committed to something small, they were willing to commit to something big. So in a jury situation, we like to commit them to small things to start with, not big things. For example, and one more comment up here. It is true that when they physically write their commitments, they're highly elevated to follow through with that commitment. Highly elevated. I don't know how we get them to write those things out, but if you can get somebody to write it out, their commitment levels go up. But here's the way we use this. Asking for a not guilty verdict from a jury right off the bat is probably too big. That's like asking them to put the big sign in front of their yard. So what do? You lead them down the golden path of commitment inch by inch, step by step. Will you agree to listen to this one witness talk about X? Yes, I will agree to that. We believe it's very important that you listen to us talk about the police officers' work that day and whether or not they found gunshot residue. Will you listen to that? Yes, I will. Good voir dire questions. You can do it in opening statement. Even though they're not responding, you can certainly ask people to commit to things you might get objected to. Who cares? Move on. You've got the commitment, right? But once we commit them to little things, we can now move on to bigger things. And the principle of persuasion kicks in. Little things, commit to bigger things. I'm committed to you to listen to your story. It's a lot easier for them to say not guilty down the road when you ask them to, because they've committed to us. By the way, prosecutors are exceptionally good at this. Do you know when they do it all the time to us? Will you obey the law? They've locked them in to a commitment. The cognitive dissonance there is all there. It's nice. There's no dissonance. I will obey the law. Will you do all the things that you... They've locked them in. They've got us right there. So we have to break back and recommit them to smaller things to take them along down the road. And sometimes it might even be, will you agree to follow the law, all the law, not just some of the law, right? It just depends. The point is, it's a principle that you should follow. Okay, we talked about this. I've only got 10 minutes. Okay, let's talk about this for a second. Principle of written words. It is true that people read things, have a higher tendency to believe them than if they're told them by the spoken word. It's part of the reason why I choose a format like this with PowerPoint. I know from experience that you will look and then listen. And so I try to put concepts up here that grab the attention without a bunch of images. That's the way I'm trying to teach this lesson. But now let me tell you how I love to use this in trial, and I have done it many times, and it is objectionable, and it is not objectionable, and again, I don't really care because it's beautiful. There's almost always a question in a trial that we know is going to go our way that's inescapable, right? We all know that question. We've had it many times. And you wait for the big moment when you ask the witness, isn't it true that you never saw my client holding the gun? And you know he's going to say, I never saw your client holding the gun. That is true. Okay? We know that moment. Well, why not do it this way? Mr. Witness, this next question I'm going to ask you is so important that I actually wrote it down, because I want to make sure that you understand it completely. And I'm putting it here on the overhead Elmo projector for you to read, and there you can read it, and you can see it, and when you're done reading it, tell me so that I can ask you. I let the question sit up there. It's on the screen. Everybody's reading the question. When it's done, I then say, isn't it true, X? Yes. Sir, would you mind writing down yes on that piece of paper? Mr. Huish, do you intend to put this into evidence? Judge, I think I just did. I don't say that. Sure, Judge, mark it as Defense Exhibit 12. I don't care. Great, yes, I would love to put this into evidence. I had a prosecutor object once. The judge says, "What? It's just a question." He just wants him to read the question. Well, how is that objectionable? I don't know. It isn't. It really isn't. If you think about it, what would you say? It's a question. He can say yes, he can say no. But here's the point. Everybody just saw it as hyper-valuable, right? It's written. Everybody read it. Everybody saw it. The written word just became my best friend. And at closing argument, don't you think that thing's coming up again? You're doggone right it is. There it is. Wonderful. All right. This is a quick one. Principle of opposite images. The pharmacy companies do this all the time. If you take Latuda, you might suffer suicidal thoughts, hair on your back, as well as a third nose. Meanwhile, on the screen are little children playing with grandpa, all running to him, hugging him, eating potato salad on the dock, right? This is actually a very powerful psychological principle that they have studied and are using very purposefully. And that is, when people have inconsistent images, almost like the Baltimore situation I did a minute ago, when they have inconsistent images, they have a dissonance that's created and they don't know which way to go. All of the bad things just got muted. So when you're talking about the horrible things about your client, maybe you have photos up about his wonderful life and you mute them. And you can mute them that way. And you really can, because it will lower the levels of things if you have that type of evidence. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Like I said, I prepare for so much and then it's not. I love the fact that we have foremans in our juries for the following reason. They can become my ally and my enemy intentionally and unintentionally. And here's the way I love to use the principle of the foreman. I invite them during closing argument to recognize that they will choose a foreman and that informant is very important to be the guide to help facilitate what I want them to facilitate. So I invite them to choose a foreman, which they're going to do. I then use the word guide so that the foreman gets an idea of how to be. Because remember, none of these people have probably ever been foremans before or forepersons before. This is the first experience. There's not a lot of instruction on what to do. There's a little bit, not a lot. And then this is what I like to say to them. And I like to say to the rest of us, are we the type of person that simply choose to vote with everyone else? Or are we the type of person that likes to vote our own conscience? Now, I've done two things. I put the 11 against the 1. This is what I want to do. I want to put the 11 against the 1. And then I want to obligate the 1, the foreman, to become the guardian of fairness. Because we know something, and that's this. 80% of the people will sit silent while 20% talk. It's a principle of life, and it was done in jury studies and found to be very accurate. And about 4 out of 12 will make the decision because the other 8 will follow along. And like we said at the very beginning, if we could put them all in quiet rooms, we'd get 12 different verdicts with 12 different reasons. Which is why I like to say to people, your reasonable doubts are your personal reasons to doubt. But here's what I love to say to a jury, to a foreman, and to the jury. One of you will be selected to be the leader and responsible director of discussions in the voting of this case. I love that. You're going to be the leader and responsible voting. You're challenging them. You'll be held to the highest standard to make sure that everyone gets a vote. Mr. Foreman, will you be willing to make sure that every person gets to talk? We all know that the more people talk, the crazier it gets back there, right? The more that talk, the better off we are. Get them going, right? And that's what we want the jury to do. And then we want to bring the other person in, other 11, and say to them, well, actually, I specify the case. You can read this later. But then I want to bring the other people and say, and you have a unique responsibility, the other 11 of you, to not let that foreman push people around or to let anybody push other people around. You're inviting them to break up the groupthink process. And I like this because you're challenging the notions of groupthink. Groupthink is a principle that says when people get into a group, they come up with a decision that they wouldn't have otherwise come up with, often. And by inviting the foreman to be the arbiter, and by challenging and having people challenge them, you're going to hopefully be fostering greater discussion. Okay. Well, that's all the time I have. I want to end by combining some principles. And let's use this one. This is kind of combining a mass of all the principles we talked about today. Together, when we began this trial, we agreed to search for truth together. And I promised that I would visit with witnesses to ask questions if the DA failed to ask all those fair questions, and not to ask if he didn't. And you remember, there were a couple times I didn't ask a single question because he'd done his job. But remember the times I didn't, and I had to stand up and ask those questions? We all agreed in those moments I would ask and you would listen, and you did. And what we discovered was that snitch did state my client confessed. That's what the snitch said. I chose the word snitch, right? That's a chosen word. Sounds dirty. The snitch stated my client confessed. I'm using that principle of now I'm going to but. But the question here today, ladies and gentlemen, is are you willing to attach your credibility to her credibility? Because that's what they're asking you to do. They're asking you to validate her credibility. This woman who is a fraudster, whose proven motive is to escape justice and punishment in exchange for a dubious testimony at jibber jabber. I love that, jibber jabber, right? That's because that's what it is. It's jibber jabber. And I finish it by saying, a woman who was facing 1,567 days in a 12 by 10 jail cell, but who discovered freedom by using her words and now takes walks daily on the wide expanses of the beach. And how did she do this? By doing what comes so naturally to a woman of her ilk. Looking at people, good people like you, right in the eyes and lying. All those principles just came together. They're all there. And isn't it a beautiful way to say, you piece of crap, right? You person of your ilk. All right. Let me conclude with this. I love who we are. I really do. I adore the fact that I am a criminal defense attorney. And I adore it for a lot of reasons. I do love a little bit being the outsider. I do love the fact that I have a singular job, and that is to protect one against the many. I don't have to think about all the problems in the world. I get to be one who's chosen to protect one. And I love the fact that we, I am emotional about this. I went to Independence Hall. It wasn't that emotional for me, but this is emotional for me. In that space, just over there, those men, 220 some odd years ago, gathered together and made sure that we existed. President, Vice President, Congress, Supreme Court, mandated by the Constitution, and each one of us are a mandated individual portion of the non-government, chosen and guaranteed by the deaths of people who have sworn to uphold the Constitution of the United States in the Sixth Amendment, that anyone who is accused shall have the right to counsel for their defense. That's us. We are the chosen ones to stand outside and defend those who cannot defend themselves, because our Constitution demands to its death that we exist. The same as the President, the same as Congress, the same as the Supreme Court. And so you know what I did for myself? I made my own Great Seal. And you know what? I have this in my office on my mouse pad and a few other places. And I keep it. And I invite you to use it. Because you know what it says? The Sixth Amendment. And to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. The last words of the Sixth Amendment. Me, Dyke Huish, criminal defense attorney, mandated by the Sixth Amendment of the United States Constitution. Thank you. Dang right. And I placed on this something. In the Supreme Court, they put 1 star below the eagle to declare 1 Supreme Court. I placed 2, touching me and my client. Constitutionally mandated from now until the end of our nation. What a beautiful thought. What an honor. What a privilege. Thank you.